Hello. I'm assuming that we're live, and I'm in the rather unusual position of uh, chairing this session remotely when all of the other panelists are in the room, and I hope you can hear me. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the panel, who are Professor Alex Zelinsky, who's Vice Chancellor of the University of Newcastle, but was previously the Chief Defence Scientist. And we have the current Chief Defence Scientist, Professor Tanya Munro, who in a previous life was also Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, so knows both the sector and government well. We also have Professor Bronwyn Harch, who's the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation at the University of Queensland. And we're also joined by Mr. Patrick Hallinan, who's the Acting Deputy National Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator. So we have a really excellent panel here to consider the topic of countering foreign interference. And what we've agreed is that I'm going to guide the panelists through a series of steps so that we get the most out of their expertise and try and structure the discussion in a way that's helpful for the audience. So I thought, Patrick, we might begin with you. And maybe you could just help set the scene for us as to why foreign interference is now considered to be such a significant threat to the university sector, and what's driving government's thinking on this topic. So over to you, Patrick.
Sure. So hello everyone, Patrick Hallinan, Acting Deputy National Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator. The first point to make is that foreign interference is really symptomatic of an increasingly contested international landscape. There are a number of countries that are seeking to interfere in the routine functioning of societies like Australia's, and we're certainly not immune to it. Consecutive heads of ASIO have described foreign interference as both unprecedented and now unacceptable. The Director General of Security recently said publicly, and I quote, "Foreign entities are constantly seeking to penetrate Australia's government, defence, academia and business to steal classified information, military capabilities, policy plans and sensitive research." The countries who seek to interfere in our society often do not share our values. They seek to project their influence or preferred behaviours outside their borders. Their activities can range from cyber attacks, efforts to disrupt or subvert our democratic processes, the promulgation of propaganda and disinformation, intellectual property theft, and attempts to inhibit the full participation in Australian society of certain community groups, in particular members of our culturally and linguistically diverse community groups, often bear the brunt of you might describe as community interference. Australia's university sector is also a target of such activity. Because it produces leading research, generates intellectual property that is of value and is perceived to be of value to other countries. It's also true for our publicly funded research agencies, and my team's been working very closely with the CSIRO in particular, but also some other PFRAs to strengthen their resilience to foreign interference. And it's equally true of our innovation sector more broadly, so really knowledge-led industry. It's important to note that many of the countries who engage in foreign interference, they don't differentiate in the way that we do between military-focused research and research that might be conducted for other purposes. And their security services are not beholden to the same sorts of oversight, processes and standards as we are here in Australia. And what that means effectively is that their nationals can be subject to forms of coercion which simply would not and do not occur in countries like Australia. More generally, some countries are also challenged by the free and open nature of our university system, where we can contest and debate ideas. And for countries where you don't have that ability to routinely engage, debate, discuss matters of sensitivity to the host government, this can cause them concern, particularly with respect to their international student populations. And this means that in some cases they take a very keen interest in the behaviours of their international students when they're overseas. These are issues which Australia is grappling with, but we're not alone. Other countries across the globe, both within our immediate region and more broadly, are also dealing with this challenge. I think if I just think about it in the university context, I know that the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada and other nations have taken a similar approach to us in terms of providing further advice to this sector around foreign interference risks and how to mitigate those risks. But more generally, the number of countries across the international community that are grappling with these issues is quite large. I might, John, leave it there if I could.
Patrick, that's a really good scene setter. I'd like now to go to Alex and Tanya, just to say a little bit about the history of university engagement with these questions, perhaps going a little further back than the current sort of heightened preoccupation with all of this. I'm thinking particularly of the Defence Trade Controls Act. Alex, do you want to kick off and just give us your thoughts on the history in this area?
Well, look, it has become a... Thank you, John. And we've got actually a chair, symbolic chair, vacant chair here. You're chairing here. You're here with us in spirit. Just going back, yes, certainly one of the things that became clear back in even 2010, 2011 was the internationalisation of universities and our research, particularly that Australia produces, say, 2% of the world's knowledge, yet there's the other 98% out there we'd like to get access to and leverage and cooperate to produce. So, and it became clear that we needed to have a regime set up. And the Americans said to us they wanted to collaborate more closely with us, but they felt we had to have foreign controls on sensitive technologies. And that's what was the motivator. But initially it was actually a piece of work that was done by the Department of Defence and just published. And it really upset everybody because it was not really well considered, the needs of not just academia but industry. And certainly the minister at the time, Stephen Smith, realised he had to go back and revisit the area, and then the government changed, and the incoming government actually realised there had to be a collaborative way of doing this. And I still recall that it was Ian Chubb and Peter Hoy who was there at the time as as a Vice Chancellor, was also involved, and we formed a committee, and it was very collaborative design. And in fact, we studied all the regimes of defence trade controls around the world, the UK, the US. The US, even though they were telling us our controls weren't adequate, their system is a labyrinth of legislation and competing laws almost passed by various departments. So we, I believe, in the end implemented a legislative framework which has had a review period built into it and revisited, got feedback in, was backed up by a very good education program which was rolled out, and the Department of Defence resourced an Office of Trade Controls. And I think that actually led to a good piece of work. And I think that inspired work that led to the UFIT guidelines, and that's probably more closer to now, and I might get Tanya to talk about that. I was a member of that task force with Tanya and others here in the room. But I think collaborative design works. And just want to say that the last piece of work, the legislation recently passed on the Foreign Relations or Foreign Arrangements Bill in December, that didn't fall into that category of collaborative design. And I think we've got issues with that, and I think the government will actually have a truckload of paperwork to deal with, because everybody's not sure exactly what constitutes an arrangement. Is it an email? Is it a conversation? And I think everyone's being very conservative there and putting forward aspects to that. So I think we've got good examples of where things have been done well. We just look back, we just got to learn from those and bring them forward. And I know there's more considerations underway in government now about critical technologies. I'd really urge government to think back and look back at what's worked. And in fact, with some of the guidelines, certainly the UFIT guidelines, are now being picked up by other European countries around the world, because it's a good piece of work.
That's a really nice place to take up. Thank you. Perhaps just to start my comments, I really wanted to echo some of Patrick's. In my 2.25 years thus far as Chief Defence Scientist, it struck me that that strategic environment in which Australia does its R&D has shifted quite substantially, and we're certainly in an era now of heightened global competition and increased external threat. Now, you all know that R&D is intrinsically collaborative, intrinsically international, but I think, and Alex has given a wonderful history of the last decade and how we've come to have the current arrangements we've got through the UFIT. I think what has changed in that time is that it is now much more apparent and much more visible at senior levels that Australia's R&D contributes very significantly to matters of defence and national security for our nation, and that's of significant interest, of course, to our allies and of course to our adversaries as well. And that we need to strike that right balance between supporting, nurturing, and encouraging that collaborative, open endeavour and being able to protect what needs to be protected so that it can flourish and produce sovereign advantage. So what you'll see in the defence context is a real commitment, unparalleled, I would argue, to really building sovereign industry, and more of that being around Australia's R&D capabilities in our universities, in our PFRAs, as Patrick mentioned. And really the agenda we need is one that protects that IP, which has both got commercial benefit, of course, as well as national security benefit. So I think that's part of the element there. In terms of the history, we clearly are on a path to more protection. And Alex has mentioned critical and sensitive tech, which I know we'll come back to in this discussion. What I'm seeing in this history is a really pleasing trend to more whole of government work. And I think it does indeed learn from the work that government did and Defence led in the Defence Trade Control Act. And indeed, as many of you would know, informed by your feedback and the feedback of industry, back last year, the Defence Export Controls is working to amend the Defence Trade Controls Act in a way that's risk-based and doesn't unnecessarily restrict trade, research or international cooperation. So I think that's encouraging, but I'd say that what we do need is to have our university partners quickly come up to speed with the risks, help their academics be educated in the new way of thinking, and make sure that we have an informed debate, because the status quo cannot continue, and we're in this new heightened risk environment. I might leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Tanya. So can we come to UFIT itself and just maybe explore what led to it, why it's considered by the sector and by government to be a valuable forum for collaboration. Like Tanya and Alex, I'm also a member of the Foreign Interference Task Force, and I know that from the university side, we highly value the collaborative and, as Alex said, co-design approach to the guidelines. But Patrick, I wondered if you'd like to just say something about how this is viewed by government and why it's seen as such an important part of our strategy for countering foreign interference.
Yeah, certainly, very happy to, John. And just to build on Alex's comments and Tanya's comments, I think it's fair to say that through the UFIT construct, which was only established in 2019, the relationship between a whole of government and the university sector has really improved dramatically. The ability for us to collaborate, and I take Alex's point around one of the critical benefits for government is the same as the benefit for the sector through the UFIT construct, which is that co-design. Certainly from a Home Affairs perspective, we're very conscious, and I'm sure Tanya would agree, we're very conscious that the people occupying the roles within the sector that really understand the tech and understand the nature of their business are often best placed to make informed decisions or support our thinking and our understanding of the nature of the risks that we're confronting. Tanya is right. It really is, it's a national level risk that we are trying to deal with. But UFIT itself, I mean, for those that aren't aware, I think it was in somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks, and please correct me, John, but from the initial time frame within which government said, we want you to produce guidelines, and the guidelines being launched by then Minister Tian. We're really happy with the work that we have seen the sector undertake since that time. We think that, you know, and again, as someone who sits routinely in the UFIT steering group at the moment alongside, you know, John and Tanya and Alex and others, the buy-in from the sector has been really positive. It's given us a really useful forum, I think, to openly discuss points of tension or friction or clearly, I guess, exchange views, which I think is fundamentally important to make sure that we're getting this right, and that neither government nor the sector, I suppose, is course correcting too much or in a way which is counterproductive. But I think from government's perspective, John, we see enormous value in the UFIT construct. It's given us a really strong foundation from a whole of government perspective. And Tanya and I were talking about this before. I might add, it's actually been quite useful to us on the government side to herd the cats, for want of a better term. This is an increasingly complex area which spans multiple portfolios. From the government side, we have Tanya is there on behalf of Defence. Home Affairs chairs it. My boss, the National Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator, is the chair. We have representatives from DESI, as you would expect, so Department of Education, Skills and Employment. The Australian Cyber Security Centre is also represented, and of course colleagues from ASIO are there, so that we've taken properly informed or having properly informed discussions from a risk perspective. But we see enormous value in UFIT. There's certainly no suggestion that from a officials level that we wish to change that in any way, shape or form, and I think we're continuing to now do some really positive work, or what will prove to be very positive work, in re-examining those guidelines and making them ideally even a bit more fit for purpose, and building on the momentum that I think has been generated in the last 18 months or so.
Thanks, Patrick. Tanya, did you want to offer your perspective, and in particular on your observations on how the sector's engaging with this process?
I'd like to second Patrick's comments. They very much gel with my own. And just really add that one thing that I'm seeing emerge, and there were echoes of it in Minister Tudge's address this morning, is as universities lean in with government and identify key areas for long-term partnership. And so, you know, with Defence, that's with our star shots, these long-term enduring research problems that have, 10 plus year time horizons. There's the ability to build in some of that deeper understanding of the threat environment, to get more university staff cleared, to be able to build some of the systems, the thinking, the cultures, the behaviours that help support better risk management. And I think that's a real positive. And I'm heartened to see that type of mission-oriented thinking, that long-term partnership, that differentiation, as I see it, for universities who can lean into some of those key problems as helping drive the culture change that we need. So that's one real positive that I'm seeing come from this. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks, Tanya. Look, I'd like to shift perspective now and look at this from an institutional point of view. And Bronwyn is joining us as a Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, who has the portfolio for a very large research-intensive university with very significant international partnerships. So, Bronwyn, I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of how your institution has responded to this. How are you navigating what is really quite a complex environment now, and can you identify any things that you've done at UQ that you think could be replicated across the sector? So over to you, Bronwyn.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. I'd just like to start by reiterating something that Tanya spoke to, and that for universities to remain globally relevant and delivering that benefit towards key societal issues, international engagement with other academic institutions, governments, and leading private sector organisations are essential. And like all universities, we acknowledge that these partnerships do give rise to risks, and they must be managed in a way that's consistent with Australia's national security. So over the past 3 years, and as John's asked me to speak to, is give a little bit of a flavour through UQ's context, I wanted to acknowledge the collaboration partnerships throughout UQ to get this done, because it's not just in one area, but also not only the collaborative design we've been doing with government, but also the collaborative design with other parts of the university sector and sharing good practice. So I think while I represent UQ's kind of perspectives, we've been trying to bring together the best as a response as well. So over those past 3 years, there's a few proactive steps that we've been undertaking, and I'm sure the journey has been similar for others. Key control measures, monitoring and reporting against those control measures that we've set up, and strengthening our enterprise risk and compliance programs as well. And importantly, it's been about supporting our staff, helping them navigate this to ensure that we do adhere to the UFIT guidelines. So the first control measure, which I won't speak very long about, is our comprehensive cybersecurity strategy that outlines that commitment to managing and reducing cyber security risks. So the second key control measure, which has been quite a journey at the university, is not relying solely on policies and procedures. They are essential, of course, but developing and implementing a series of 4 disclosure tools. And this requires disclosure and consequent management. So conflicts of interest, secondary employment, sensitive research, and foreign influence. So from May in 2020, all UQ staff are required to disclose their interests. So that's all of UQ staff, and that's done on an annual basis or when their circumstances change. Activities and positions, including any foreign talent recruitment programs, are reported in accordance with our conflicts of interest policy as well. So there's a number of functions of having these online register tools, of course, which is beyond just the data collection. There's what do you do with it? So it's helping us raise with leaders and staff the awareness of the importance of these risks, about the risks related to not only foreign influence, but data theft and espionage, educating staff on aspects of their obligations through the way we ask questions through that register, and importantly, providing line of sight for managers and supervisors so they can work with their staff around management plans or doing extra due diligence at an organisational level. It's also providing training to staff, that reporting I mentioned to line managers, and where those different approvals are needed. And those comprehensive reports now are available to our line managers and heads of units, and we've had a very strong uptake in the disclosure with, at this point in time, for all those 4 tools, it's over 90% for each one of them. But we also took into account additional due diligence by undertaking an external audit of publicly available information, and this particularly was related to foreign talent programs. And if and when we did identify some risks, it was taking appropriate remedial actions, including investigating the matter, referring it to the granting bodies and regulatory authorities in accordance with applicable laws and the funding guidelines for those different schemes. The third key control measure has been improvements to our sanctions and defence export controls compliance system. In my sense, all university has done similar approaches there. So I'll just finish, John, with 3 kind of implementation examples. When the background of, in my case, when I'm dealing with a high degree research student, suggests there's an association with an institution with close ties to the military, and the proposed research is in a sensitive area, we've declined to engage with that prospective HDR student. If the research proposal is in a sensitive area, and amongst other reasons as well, and we're always considering things on a case-by-case basis, we decline around having that second appointment for the staff member. And the other things that we've done around secondary appointments is making sure we're adjusting the full-time equivalent, that FTE adjustment, and also thinking about the requirement on restrictive IP agreements to be put in place to make sure we can give approval to these joint appointments. So hopefully, John, that's given a bit of a flavour of the institutional level implementation and some examples of where the decision process has had us stop doing some things and really thinking about with our staff the partnerships we want to engage with globally.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think UQ is really leading the way in some of these respects. And I think there's a lot that we can learn, particularly that conflict of interest policy that you've put in place. It's very impressive. Alex, you've come in from the cold. You know, you're now a vice chancellor, having worked as a chief defence scientist. Any observations from you about how your institution is now responding to this and the challenges and perhaps some of the risks associated with compliance with these sorts of guidelines and legislation?
Thanks, John. I just want to reinforce the good points that Bronwyn made. We think UQ is doing a wonderful job, good practice there, which should be spread and communicated. In fact, we've been working very closely with UQ on certainly those declarations and getting the right risk framework put in place for our universities. So I urge other universities to have a look at what UQ is doing. It's good, solid framework work. And I'll try to concentrate on things that are a little bit different to what Bronwyn said. So I'll probably make 2 points. One is around the cybersecurity risk. That is still a huge challenge for foreign interference, and be it not just from national agencies or national players, but actual criminal gangs, and for ransomware and all these sort of things. And it could be just for the stealing information for commercial gain. So it's a very serious risk. I still think that our universities are underdone in that area. One of the things I pushed very hard on when I joined the university after being in government and seeing the risks is we've moved our whole IT infrastructure into the cloud. So we're the first university, I think, in Australia, and I think the only at this stage that is fully in the cloud. So there are no exchange servers being operated. These are always areas of risk. There's a whole bunch of technology risks that go with it. And I really do think that we've got to move into that space. It's much better to see what's actually better ring fencing around sensitive areas in a university, being able to see attacks earlier, being able to respond quicker, and being able to be right at the forefront of any technology upgrades. And I think we also need a more national approach around that best practice. And I think I can see my colleagues here from AARNet here, the chairs here, Jared Sutton, the CEO, I can see there as well, Chris Hancock, so welcome guys. But I think there's a bigger role for AARNet to potentially play in the whole cybersecurity space, because they actually provide the glue between the institutions and offshore, of course. So I think there could be something around best practices there that I think that they could play a role in or assist us. So a call out to them. And last thing I'd like to say, John, is that we have to be serious about, as a sector, about the UFIT guidelines and implementing them, proportionate to each institution. Some institutions may not have a lot of international research going on, so they may have a different element of what they do. So it's courses for courses, but we must implement it. And I think we got a sense of that this morning from the Minister around the freedom of speech, how the code has been implemented, and he actually was talking about legislating in the end. And I think that's what could happen if we don't take UFIT guidelines seriously and it's best to be working in self-regulation, adhering to standards rather than having a sledgehammer being imposed to the sector. So it's a word of warning and encouragement to everyone to get on board this, because these guidelines make sense.
Thanks, Alex. Tanya, did you want to comment?
Just some brief comments. Very wise words, Alex. I urge people to take them to heart. Just a couple of other quick comments. Defence has a university best practice working group at a working level that I know many of your universities engage with. That's a really great safe space to ask questions, to see what some of the other universities are doing. If you're not aware, we also have a Defence Research Collaboration Security Framework with the most terrible acronym, DRCSF, which now applies to all work, all external R&D that is done with the Department of Defence. This sits in the context of the Defence Industry Security Program, or the DISP, and it's really lovely that most universities either have or are en route to getting their DISP accreditation. That lifts the security posture of your institutions. They're good steps, but really ultimately the getting people working together on big-scale collaborative projects in precincts, to use University of Queensland as an example. We have a new facility in Queensland where we have defence scientists sitting alongside some of our uniformed colleagues, sitting alongside industry and UQ, focused on some of the hypersonics research we do together. That's a wonderful example where those university researchers understand the security context because they work alongside their Commonwealth colleagues. The more we can work like that, the more we can mitigate the risks.
Thanks, Tanya. Look, I'd like to come in a moment to discussing the future of all of this, and I think Alex has raised a really important question about taking the guidelines more seriously. But before we do that, Bronwyn, I just wanted to ask you, based on your experience, whether, going back to a point that Tanya made earlier about getting the balance right between addressing security concerns on the one hand, but not inhibiting valuable research and research collaborations on the other. And you mentioned a couple of concrete examples earlier. Are you yet seeing any evidence that by increasing the emphasis on security concerns, we're potentially putting at risk valuable research collaborations?
As I get to answering your question, John, again, I want to reiterate that the vast majority of research activity remains unchanged. There's a small number of activities that are requiring some extra due diligence and consideration, and there's a very small number of areas that we have decided to not pursue based on the UFIT guidelines. And so I think that understanding that kind of funnel of the majority of the effort remains unchanged when it comes to research and innovation. I think the opportunity to discuss this with our researchers has been invaluable because of the extra things you get to talk to them about, but also because you have to go into special cohorts, particularly around sensitive research, to enable them to ask the questions, noting the comments that Tanya says, well, where you can ask questions with friends. The case-by-case approach for that pointy end where we have a small number of cases has been really important to make sure you really understand the different perspectives. Self-censorship is something that is occurring in the sector. And I think it's how we work with our researchers for them to not self-censor by default, but work through with them how they can work in areas or they having to be managed in a certain way to enable them to do that. I know some of our international partners with renewing agreements, they may not be renewing them at long periods of time because they're watching the geopolitical landscape as well. And some of our partners are interested in our supervisors' citizenship and residency status as well, particularly when they're working in areas of sensitive research. So again, I think it's beholden on us to make sure we think of these things on a case-by-case basis, but within the context of UFIT guidelines.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Bronwyn. So can I come then to the final question before we go to questions from the audience, which is, what's the future? Where to from here with UFIT and other regulatory, legislative regimes? What can government and the university sector expect from each other in the future? And perhaps to Alex's point, how can we persuade government that we're taking all of this seriously? So Patrick, I might start with you and then we'll work along the panel and then go to questions. So over to you, Patrick.
Sure, thanks, John. Probably the key point to make, I think, is the work that we're doing collectively at the moment to refresh the guidelines. And I think that's what the near term looks like for us. We are working with the sector and we'll engage, no doubt, in a fulsome consultation process or a broad consultation process at the appropriate point. That's not intended to be sort of using weasel words. It's just simply we need to do the work first upon which we can engage with the sector to get reactions to the areas of, I guess, different emphasis that we might seek to pursue this time through the refresh. But I think that it does give us a really good opportunity to build on the good work that's been done, ideally to learn some of the lessons that have been applied across the sector. And I think going to this point of how do we assure government that it's being taken seriously and it's being worked upon, I think the best way to do that is to be able to demonstrate wherever possible consistency. Now that doesn't mean that consistency needs to be identical between a high risk setting or piece of research and a lower risk setting and piece of research, but if we can point to, I guess, some consistency in the application of due diligence processes, I think that would be a really useful starting point. If we can demonstrate to government or the Parliament, we shouldn't lose sight of the PJCIS, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security's inquiry that's currently underway into these matters as well. The more that the sector is in a position to be able to demonstrate that it has indeed taken steps to mitigate risk. I think proportionality is important, so this isn't about saying that something that might be necessary in a research intensive setting need apply across the entirety of the sector, but I think that will be important. In terms of sort of future legislation or other changes, look, I'm not really in a position to speculate, frankly, but I probably should acknowledge, I think Alex mentioned the reforms that are in train under the Security of Critical Infrastructure regime. All I would simply say, so there's a bill that's being worked at the moment to reform that regime and ensure that it is, I guess, and again, the Act was only passed into law in 2018. It's telling that it's necessary to revisit that now. I think it backs in again, if you need to be convinced that the world is changing rapidly, I think it's further evidence that the world has indeed changed dramatically and continues to. But it's very promising signs at the moment in terms of Home Affairs' view of what additional regulation may be necessary through that scheme, if any, of the university sector. They've had very close regard to the UFIT, the application of the UFIT, the existence of the UFIT steering group in, I guess, forming a view that it's highly unlikely, I would suggest, that there will be a big sledgehammer coming down from a security critical infrastructure perspective. But I'll stop there because I'm sure others have plenty of other things to say.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for mentioning the Parliamentary Joint Committee and the other legislative instruments that are around, which of course form an important part of the context for all of this. But Tanya, over to you.
I'd like to say be proactive in your response. Share the stories of the decisions you're making and the choices you're making in response to UFIT. Show that you're leaning in to UFIT, because I think the more that government can be reassured that it's making a difference, that it's shaping that national university sector, the more we'll be able to use it as a whole of government tool to do that shaping, and the less risk we'll have of universities being subject to really difficult legislation from across different parts of government. That's my advice.
Great advice, Tanya. Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, okay, thank you, John. Just thinking how to make this constructive. So I think certainly government has done a great thing with the defence trade controls and reformed it. Big tick. UFIT, a tick. In fact, we're reforming the guidelines. We're all going to be involved. But I can't give a tick to the foreign relations bill that was passed last year. It's just not right for the sector. Overreach and poorly designed. We need to have a rethink on that. There needs to be a consultation process to bring everybody in, because the intent is right, but the way it's been put together is just not fit for purpose, and we've just got to call that out. And going forward on that, just to learn these lessons, we've got two really good examples, one poor one, not to repeat history. So the next thing that we know will be coming is thinking about this other sensitive technologies which are dual use, which are not necessarily applicable to, for example, artificial intelligence. You could imagine that being used in various contexts, both for societal benefit, but also for military or national security purposes. Let's not create another regulatory bill or access. I think the Defence Trade Controls has these lists of technologies and how they're managed and all the bits about how you control its export, disclosure, etc. I believe we've already got a framework that could actually be very easily adapted or modified to include these new technologies as they emerge, because they will continually come up because it's a moving field. So, and to do it collaboratively. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Bronwyn.
I think I'm going to refer back to something that Arthur Sinodinos said in an earlier session, actually. He was speaking a lot about US policy in relation to foreign interference, but he was also speaking about investment in around research that was related to making sure sovereign capability was available. So I think having an ongoing dialogue with government around those dimensions is really important. And it's how the government can help position us, whether it's with Five Eyes or whichever kind of bilateral arrangements, to make sure we continue to have those dedicated international partnerships on research that remain within the UFIT guidelines, but brings a Team Australia approach to delivering that innovation to the world and bringing that benefit of R&D through to our own society as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Thank you to all of our panel members. Could I ask the audience just to show their appreciation before we move to questions? Thank you. So we've got now about 14 minutes for questions. Can I ask you to input those into your app? And I'm assuming that I will get to see what they are in my remote location. Here we go. Okay, thank you. So we've got quite a lot of questions here. We'll get through as many of these as we can, and there is an upvoting system. So I'll ask the one that has had the most votes. And this comes from Andrew Smith, and it's directed to Bronwyn. And he's got quite a specific question. He says, thank you for describing UQ's approach with joint appointments or other employments, but do you include adjunct appointments at overseas institutions in this category? So Bronwyn.
Thanks for the question, Andrew. Yes, we do include adjunct appointments. There's very many different interpretations of what adjunct means by different organisations internationally, and so that's why we have included it in our disclosures.
Great, thanks, Bronwyn. So we might go to the next question, which comes from Sue Dodds. And she asks, in the current work of revising the foreign interference guidelines, can a more positive account of the value to Australia that comes from open science and collaboration be brought forward to counter the chilling effect on low-risk research collaborations that appears to be accompanying increased government interest in university research arrangements? So I think this goes back to the question, again, I think this is a really important question. How do we balance security concerns with preserving free and open collaboration? Bronwyn, you've already commented on this. I don't know if you want to add anything to what you've already said.
No, I think the others are probably well placed to comment on that.
Okay. Alex?
Yeah, I guess that I think it's important to talk about, again, when we describe successes of the universities, we do talk about the successes of individual institutions. It's probably something for the sector to be championing or talking about great research collaborations with industry, with global collaborations with many nations. And I think there's still, I think the way also Arthur Sinodinos talked about things this morning was about not disengaging with other countries, like China, for example, not to disengage. There'll be areas we can collaborate with them, say in climate change or other areas. So remember that some areas we work with you, other areas we don't, you know, and that's being strategic. That's knowing what your core businesses are and what are your important assets, and we should celebrate the great collaborations we have to show that they're not. And I know there's that effect sometimes in universities. Well, working with a particular country is no good, so I won't do anything. Rather than really thinking about actually there is lots you could do. There's just certain areas which are sensitive, and we should try to avoid them.
Yeah, and I think some people have expressed concern about the foreign agreements legislation, that it has a chilling effect on what could be desirable research collaboration. But Tanya.
Look, I note that, and I think that is a real risk to Australia. The changing global circumstances actually mean that there's an increased appetite for enhanced mutual reliance with allies. And if we don't make that come alive in research, then we've lost a huge opportunity for our nation. So we've got to make sure that changes to how we manage risk allow us to embrace that growing appetite we have from allies and like-minded countries with similar value systems that value the research we do, and that give us the chance to get better impact from that research by partnering. So that's very much in my mind as we go into this refresh of the guidelines. It is a Team Australia approach, but it's not a Fortress Australia approach. We need to make sure we make it easier for our academics to work with allied nations, including and especially in some of these critical and sensitive tech areas.
That's a great way of putting it, Tanya. Team Australia, not Fortress Australia. Patrick, any thoughts?
Look, just 2 points. I just echo Tanya. Certainly from my team's engagement, we know that the work that we have done in the university sector is of keen interest to partners. We know that actually the model that we've taken, which is non-regulatory, is of keen interest. So, you know, particularly, you know, well, anyway, I won't go into further detail, but we know it's of keen interest. I expect that when borders reopen and researchers are engaging more directly once again with their international counterparts, I don't think it will only be Australian researchers who are talking about these issues and thinking about these issues. I think this is part of a broader shift in the research community, you know, globally. But look, in terms of the other element of the question, John, look, we have an opportunity collectively through the UFIT steering group to think about how we best present these issues. How do we best present and balance the economic and other national benefit that's derived from international collaboration with, I guess, a clear-eyed and risk-based management approach, as you know, Bronwyn's articulated in terms of UQ's approach. How do we best balance you know, the risks and benefits associated with international collaboration? So it's not about precluding such collaboration, it's just about ensuring that you know, properly informed, and I guess if it requires complex decision making, that complex decision making is indeed occurring, and you know, I might leave it there.
Thank you, Patrick. So we might go back to the questions. We've still got about 8 minutes left. Now, the next question I think is almost one we've just been discussing. How do we manage the tensions between the need to collaborate for economic prosperity, sovereign capability, and foreign interference? So I think we might just hold that one, and I'll ask panel members to bear that in mind, just in case they have anything left they want to say on that topic. But we might go to the next one as well, which is a more specific one about the University of Sydney. Has it gone too far with its conflict of interest requirements for high degree research students? Now, Patrick, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but I'm sure Bronwyn is. Bronwyn, any thoughts on that particular one?
Yeah, so I can't comment specifically on what the Uni of Sydney is doing. I dared not do that, but I can reflect. On what's going on at UQ in relation to HDR students, and this we have found is one of the areas where higher risk comes in. And so with the way that we're engaging with HDR students as they commence with us is to have discussions with them around the areas of research they're working in. Are they sensitive research? And what appointments do they have at other organisations? So we are using this similar framework of using the UFIT guidelines as we're considering HDR students joining us.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Alex, did you want to make a comment?
We just get, thank you. Bronwyn's answered. Well, I think our view is that we just want people to be open and transparent with who they work with.
Yeah.
And if it's sensitive, then we would get into a conversation. And that applies to every staff member, every student.
Tanya?
That was exactly my point. In my view, HDR students should be treated like research staff. They are an important integral part of this system, and we need to make sure that we have an understanding of any factors that might impact on their work.
Yeah, thanks. Patrick, did you want to offer a view on this?
Probably I don't have a whole heap more to add, to be frank. John, I'm not deeply familiar with it. I read some press about it. It was an interesting article or two.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Okay, we'll go back to the questions. The next one is there a framework, or do individual universities have a framework for differentiating between the risk of different activities or disclosures? Really interesting question. And Alex, you mentioned this question of proportionality. How do you think universities should address this? Because there is a risk that we hyper comply and kill off a lot of valuable activity when actually the risk is almost zero. Bronwyn, you've probably got the closest experience of managing this at a coalface. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the question's gone just off the screen there just to keep me to the point, but anyways, I'll try my best.
Well, it was really about risk assessment and I guess proportionality.
Yeah, so I think for us, the way we've been dealing with it is in that the quality of the questions that you ask, that you get to flush out the risk of the different activities. So I think it's that the interaction of the sensitive research areas, thinking about sanctions and controls and doing it in that kind of way. So I think it's really about the quality of the questions that you ask. So the person asked about the framework. So the framework for us has been the quality of the questions that you ask when people are doing disclosures.
Yeah, and as you say, it means you get to know your researchers much better.
Yeah.
Alex, any comments?
No, I think the UFIT guidelines provide a great sort of set of lenses to which to look at these sort of risks, and you just answer the question for your institution. Each institution is different, each circumstance is different, so it's proportionate. So you don't apply the same approach to, say, people studying in our, say, law faculty as you might do into your science faculty, or you've just got to have to look at things in a different way, and I think that requires judgment. And I think we've got people. I've got a lot of faith in our DVCRs.
Thanks.
And Tanya, any thoughts as a former DVCR?
Two comments. Firstly, if you try to use the UFIT guidelines as they are currently and find that there are things that arise for you in doing that, that'd make great feedback into the refresh of the guidelines, firstly. Secondly, all of your universities have areas where you're working with defence and national security, parts of government in research. Ask them, have frank and open and transparent conversations, because we do that risk assessment on all work we do together, and there's a chance to take some of that risk and security culture into your universities.
Patrick, one of the headings in the UFIT guidelines is about knowledge sharing. And of course, knowledge is one way in which we can assess where the areas of risk really are. To me, that's one of the most valuable aspects of the guidelines, is that it ensures that government and the sector talk much more regularly, and we get a much better sense of where the real risks are. Is there any comment you wanted to make about that information sharing aspect of the guidelines?
I guess, John, the key point I'd make is I think that there's more for us to do. I think we've started well. There are a variety of sort of moving parts. We've talked about critical technology. There are different moving parts within government that are focused on critical technology policy. Alex has expressed some views around some of the sort of the defence the defence frameworks that exist around sensitive goods and technology and so on and so forth. I really think one of the key opportunities that's now before us collectively through the refresh is looking for those opportunities to share examples of best practice, looking for those opportunities because we've obviously got Bronwyn here talking about the great work that UQ has done, which I think is generally acknowledged as really good work in the due diligence space. There are other unis that have also done really good stuff in the last 18 months. CSIRO has had, and again, I don't wish to pretend that there's a direct application between CSIRO considerations and the uni sector's considerations, but a lot of the principles are quite similar. So I think we're in a really good place to potentially be able to share more information around frameworks, tools, different approaches that people are taking to allow effectively people to either sort of choose best of breed or think about how might that apply in my environment. So I think the knowledge sharing component is really key. That's definitely one of those benefits of the steering group, but I think we're at that next phase now, which frankly might assist us again in terms of satisfying government if we can see a little bit of traction in those areas where the sector believes that actually there is something. So maybe we're going to use 70% of UQ's due diligence process as something that might apply neatly across the sector. But a lot of this is just, it's fundamentally about managing risk. I know that in terms of some of the work that CSIRO's doing, that the way that they try to quickly determine what level of due diligence is required or what level of governance is necessary in terms of taking an ultimate decision around whether to go or no go in an area of research is really thinking fundamentally about the nature or risk attendant to the party, the collaborator, and the nature of the research. And if you conceivably, if you're a partner that you consider might enliven higher risk, but it's a low risk research collaboration, then that might mean that it gets directed to a fairly routine decision-making process, and you don't need to spend a whole heap of time forensically going through the details. Alternatively, if it's a high-risk partnership or a high-risk or high-interest area of research, then it might warrant a further set of questions or examination and a different level, a more escalated or elevated level of decision-making around whether to go or no go. So I think both government has some more work to do, and within the sector, I think we're really well placed now to just share those examples of the good work that's been done to date and build on that.
Fantastic. Look, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but I'd just like to thank our panel. It's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And once again, could I ask the audience just to thank our panelists in the usual way? Thank you very much. Okay, on to the next.
UniSuper was established over 35 years ago as the super fund for the higher education and research sector. We have grown to be the 5th largest superannuation fund in Australia, with more than 450,000 members and over $95 billion in funds under management. From 5 July, we're opening the door on a new era, bringing better value super to more Australians and welcoming new members from outside of the higher education and research sector. We're excited to bring our award-winning range of services and investments to a wider audience, while continuing to offer the same high standards our existing members have come to expect. So, tell your family and friends they can now enjoy the same great benefits as you do. Visit unisuper.com.au/register-interest.